everybody, and welcome to JTV. Today we are joined from Israel by Rabbi and historian Ken Spiro. He's a great friend of the show and a friend and mentor to me personally. Rabbi, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. The first thing we want to talk to you about is Hanukkah. Hanukkah's coming up very shortly, and I get the sense that the average person on the street, non-Jew and even some Jews, don't actually appreciate and understand a great deal of the history behind the story of Hanukkah and its significance for us today. Would you be able to start off as a Jewish historian by taking us through the history and, more importantly, its significance to us today?
Sure. Well, you got to back up a little bit and explain Hanukkah, first of all, is the Jewish people's first interaction with European civilization. And it starts in about 331 BCE when Alexander the Great, in the middle of his decade-long massive military conquest of the Middle East, does a little detour and peacefully conquers the land of Israel. And this begins this great interaction between this very sophisticated, beautiful Greek culture of Europe and the Jewish people in the land of Israel. After he dies, his empire divides into different parts. Israel is initially under the Seleucid Greek Empire, which is based in Egypt, and then it ends up under the control of it's originally under the Ptolemaic Greek Empire in Egypt, and then it ends up under the control of the Seleucid Greek Empire, which is in basically the area of Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Greek Empire. And it's during that time when we Jews, by the way, are at this time the only monotheistic faith in the world. Today, there are billions of people who profess to be monotheists besides Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But at the time, we were this radically different people. Everyone else is swapping their gods, and it's a polytheistic world. And in the middle of this world is this teeny nation that believes in this one God and will not recognize or worship anyone else's gods, which engendered a certain level of, if you read Greek and Roman writers, and this is the first time in history that historians appear in the West and the Jews appear on the radar, they constantly talk about the Jews being the weirdest people. Remember that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus? The rest of the world is from Mars and Jews are from Venus. So there's a tension, even though there's a lot of positive interaction and Jews are very much attracted to a lot of aspects of Greek culture and Greek philosophy. There's a certain tension in the fact that we Jews refuse to assimilate into Greek culture will eventually cause, in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Greeks to attempt something that is unprecedented until that time, which is to go after another people's faith and beliefs. People fought wars throughout history over territory, but no one ever fought a war over what another people believe in. And it's really history's first religious ideological war. There's a lot of misunderstanding about Hanukkah. People think it's a struggle for liberation from occupation under the hand of Alexander the Great and the later Greek empires. The Greeks had already occupied the land of Israel for more than a century and a half. It's only when the Greeks went after not Jews, but Judaism, that an elder priest by the name of Matisyahu and his 5 sons rose up in revolt in an attempt to basically stop the forced assimilation of the Jewish people. And this will trigger history's first religious ideological war, which also people tend not to understand is not only ideologically based, but also is very long. It's a struggle off and on for 25 years, during which not only Mattathias dies, but 4 of his 5 sons are either fall in battle or are murdered in various plots. It's the fact that the Jews are able to militarily defeat what is a far superior Greek army, using brilliant tactics, primarily under the leadership of the leading brother of these brothers, who are called the Maccabees, Yehuda HaMaccabee, Judah the Maccabee. It's in and of itself a pretty amazing feat. After 3 years of fighting, they liberate Jerusalem, which is the spiritual political capital of the Jewish people, which had been taken over by the Seleucid Greeks, and they'd actually turned the temple in Jerusalem, which was the world's central, one and only monotheistic site, into a pagan shrine. They liberate Jerusalem and rededicate the temple to the worship of God. But the struggle goes on for many, many years, and eventually, after about 25 years of off and on conflict, the Greeks finally give up, and Israel will gain independence for a little over a century and will be led by the various descendants of the Maccabees, Simon the Maccabee and his children and his children's children, until the arrival of the Romans in the year 63 BCE, when Israel is then absorbed into the now far larger and more, and much greater power of what is the Roman Empire. But the other thing, Ollie, that people tend to miss about the Hanukkah story is I always ask the question, the military victory seems like a much more impressive feat. The Jewish guerrilla army outnumbered tremendously by professional Greek soldiers with elephants and phalanx. Yet we don't mention very much about that. And the holiday is commemorated by the lighting of menorah, a little candelabra, which is symbolic of the menorah, the candelabra that stood in the temple itself. And in the Talmud, it mentions just very briefly in one paragraph that when Jerusalem was liberated, there wasn't enough sacred oil that wasn't defiled to keep that menorah burning. Traditionally, it always burned, and a miracle took place. And instead of burning for 1 day, it burned for 8 days. You think about it objectively, the military victory is far greater than a little menorah burning for 8 days. I mean, Jewish history is full of much more impressive miracles of seas splitting and great empires being destroyed by supernatural plagues. But if we understand, going back to what I said is the real background to the revolt of Hanukkah, the menorah, which is symbolic of light, is really the essence of the holiday, where the Greeks were trying to snuff out the light of monotheism. Had they succeeded, the world, I don't think, would exist today, but we would not have Christianity, Islam, modern liberal democracy, all the things that basically grew out of Judaism. So even though it's relatively speaking a small miracle, the symbolism of the survival of the spirituality of the survival of the Jewish people and the survival of a faith that has transformed the world is the real central focus of this holiday and what we're talking about.
Right. And that's why it can sometimes be quite amusing that many people sort of see it as like the Jewish Christmas, and it's sort of commercialized and all these things, and sort of stripped of its spiritual and religious essence, and so ironic, because of course that was the whole point of the Hanukkah celebration. Hanukkah meaning to rededicate the temple service. It was really a celebration of the Jewish values and mission for the world continuing.
True. By the way, it specifically mentions in multiple places in the Talmud the date in the month of Kislev, where we are now, which happens to fall out around December time. So it really did happen. Then I always say there's a deeper meaning. The fact that that is in the northern hemisphere, the winter solstice and the darkest time of the year, it's kind of very fitting that precisely what is the darkest time of the year when it gets dark in Israel, already by 5 o'clock, it's pitch black outside, that holiday falls out, the Festival of Lights at that time. It fits perfectly. The irony of what you're saying, you talked about the Jewish Christmas, is the opposite is actually true. Not that we're talking about Christianity, but the birth date of Jesus, all of that exists in a historical vacuum. We have no idea of when the real date is, but we do know that early Christianity, which only takes form many centuries after, the Jesus narrative and the gospel, one of the things they were very much involved in was to depaganize the pagan world by Christianizing it. And we know the winter solstice amongst pagan cultures is universally a time of religious holidays. The holiday of Saturnalia. Saturn is the god of agriculture in the Roman Empire, or Sol Invictus, the sun god of Rome. Precisely when it's getting darkest, people got really suspicious. Maybe it's going to keep getting darker until the world will disappear in darkness. So almost all pagan cultures in the Northern Hemisphere in December have some sort of holiday centered around the winter solstice. And it could very well be that Christmas is deliberately placed there to basically Christianize what was a pagan time of year, which is a very common theme in early Christianity. So we had it right in the first place. It's funny you say that, because also I was raised with very little Jewish knowledge, and I thought that Hanukkah was clearly a holiday invented by the rabbis, because if Jews living amongst Gentiles saw that they weren't getting presents, maybe they'd convert. But as Adam Sandler says in his song, we get 8 nights of presents instead of 1 morning.
Exactly. Although I don't know, when did the presents tradition start? When did that start becoming a thing?
That's also, there's an idea of Hanukkah guilt, which is it goes back a while, giving money on Hanukkah. The idea of buying, first of all, stores with toys in them is a very new invention. People didn't have toy stores hundreds of years ago. You didn't have that kind of stuff. But that definitely, look, the holidays have been very commercialized. There's no question. Both Christmas has lost most of its religious significance, and obviously Hanukkah hasn't lost its significance. It's kind of been transformed into one of those holidays of freedom, and it's an excuse to eat a lot of fried food. But I think the present aspect of it, there's definitely something going on there with that time of year and retail.
Right, right. Of course, of course. And it's so interesting that you talk about this concept of darkness and light, because, of course, the Midrash, the rabbinic commentary on the Torah, talks about the four exiles at the beginning of the Torah, where it talks about a darkness being across the earth. And they say that refers to the history of the Greeks, the Greek period, and them entering conquering Israel, and Greece representing darkness in a way. I know that the Greeks, they banned certain particular, specific mitzvot, certain laws from Jewish practice in Israel when they conquered it. What were those specific laws, and why them?
Well, they went after, first of all, they went after a circumcision, which is the most powerful sign of our covenant between us and God. Anyone caught circumcising their kids was killed. But they went. It was just called the Shema. They basically went after Torah. They went after the temple. They made it the temple of Olympian Zeus. They were just trying to undermine anything that was a connection to our relationship with God. But the circumcision is specifically mentioned as one of the things they went after. But and we don't necessarily have. We don't know the story of Hanukkah. We don't have in the Hebrew Bible. There's 8 different books that have the title of the Book of the Maccabees, though they're not in the Jewish Bible because they were given to us after the Hebrew Bible was closed, and they're not written by prophets, which every book of the Hebrew Bible is. But they are in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox texts. And from the Book of the Maccabees, we get a sense that, it says, I believe in the First Maccabees, that an Athenian senator was sent to get the Jews to forsake the God of their fathers. So they definitely went, because pagan culture and Jewish culture share one thing in common, the idea of a temple site and sacrifice. The difference being, of course, that in Judaism, we know God's infinite. He doesn't need a piece of meat. Not to do a whole discussion on sacrifice, but has much more to do with, the word korban and karev, to come close, and the fact that life is only meaningful because there is death, the contrast, sacrifice, versus the pagan notion that, their gods need a stake. So that one of the first things they really went after is the whole central worship in Jerusalem of the temple, which is something we don't appreciate today because we don't have that today. But Judaism of this period of time is very, very much centered on the priestly service that was done in the temple in Jerusalem, the central religious site and the central activity in terms of connectivity to God. So they went after that, and they took over the site and turned it into a pagan site, and they're sacrificing pigs to Zeus on the site. But there's no doubt that they went after things like the Jewish calendar, sanctification of this. Will be repeated, by the way. The Romans will try the same thing later in history, because we sanctify time. If we can disconnect the Jewish people from their fundamental mode of worship, their calendar, etc., we'll be able to wean them off of their primitive faith, and they'll join the bigger world of polytheism. Which, by the way, Ali, is interesting. People don't get this point either. That and it's a theme that's repeated throughout history. When we're exposed to a foreign culture, and Greek culture was the happening culture of that period of time. The Greeks were cultural imperialists. They not only conquered territory and just had you pay taxes, they actually exported their culture, the theater, their sporting events, everything they're thinking was exported to the countries, and it merges with the countries and creates a hybrid culture, which becomes the dominant culture of the Mediterranean. So, and there's a lot of beauty in Greek culture. The rabbis say a lot of nice things about the Greek language, by the way, which was considered the most beautiful of all languages, so beautiful that the original pure ancient Greek was considered a language you could write a Torah scroll in, and you could actually read from it, and it was legitimate, like reading it in Hebrew. So there was a lot of aspects of Greek culture that were considered very beautiful, even from a rabbinic perspective. But obviously, like upper class Jews, especially, who have the free time to participate in cultural activities, like going to the theater and the sporting events, they were drawn to this, and many of them became Hellenized. The word for Greece is Hellas. So, and these Jews became more Greek than the Greeks themselves. And it's another great discussion of when Jews trying to out Gentile Gentiles and being a Gentile, sometimes they become the biggest anti-Semites, which goes to a central point of Hanukkah that's completely missed, is that it really started out first and foremost by a small group of influential, powerful Jews who were enamored with Greek culture, trying to get the Greeks to help, say with quotation marks, their fellow Jews wean themselves off of their primitive monotheistic Judaism and enter this more beautiful, modern, progressive culture of what was Greece.
Do we know
They're the ones. Yeah.
Do we know what percentage became Hellenized?
We don't know that, but it's a small percent. When Josephus comes on the scene and talks about like the Sadducees, who are not the same thing as the Hellenists, they exist a later period of time. He mentions that they're a smaller percentage, but they're elite, and they're, like a lot of groups today, you see, there may be a few of them, but they're embedded in places where they have massive amount of influence, and also tend to have the wealth and the connections to have the maximum influence. So they're the ones, because the average non-Jew doesn't know what makes Jews tick. It takes someone who's from the inside, who's left and knows how to go after, the jugular vein of the Jewish people, or the Achilles heel. These are people who are really dangerous. And we see that throughout history.
And so the Greek invasion can be characterized not so much as an exterminationist conquest, but, well, it's an assimilationist conquest to try to get rid of the Jewish soul, not the Jewish body. And therefore, in essence, you still have Jews walking around, but they're not Jewish in the sense of representing or practicing the Jewish culture or beliefs and values.
100%. When, by the way, once Jews, and this is again a pattern that's the Greeks' goal back then, but it's relevant today. When Jews leave Judaism behind, within 3 generations, usually statistically, and 5 absolutely maximum, they're gone. They just marry out and disappear. So it's a way of getting the Jews to assimilate. But again, it wasn't the original Greek invasion; was a physical invasion, which was peaceful. Alexander the Great had one of the notoriety of being one of the only people to conquer Jerusalem without a fight. We didn't stand up against him. The city was surrendered peacefully. But we fast forward a century and a half later, it was what's called a shmad. In Jewish law and halakha, there's 2 kinds of attacks. There's an attack against the Jewish body physically, which is the Holocaust. Hitler was going after Jews physically. And there's an attack against the Jewish soul, the spirituality. And by the way, the reaction, it's interesting that in the case of a spiritual threat, there's much less wiggle room. You're supposed to give your life rather than violate pretty much anything, because you're making a stand about what is so important to us, which is our relationship with God, our eternity, our soul, spirituality. Whereas when it's a physical threat like Hitler, you can violate pretty much all of Jewish law with a few exceptions to preserve your life, because it's about preserving your life. It's not an attack against your faith.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. It seems counterintuitive. You'd think the greater reaction would be a physical threat would lead to a more stringent reaction in terms of physically, but the reality is the opposite is true.
Although it is interesting, because some of the times the anti-Semitism is a mixture of both, isn't it?
It definitely can be, and it kind of morphs from one into the other today. They definitely are intertwined. And often the attacks against Judaism are used as an ideological level, or used as physical attacks against Jews. We see this beginning already back in the Greek-Roman world, of a guy like Appian writing this book. But he's prolifically writing about how weird Jews are, and that they obviously don't fit in, and they're therefore a danger and a threat. And that will be used as a launching point for ultimately physical attacks against us too. The irony is, of course, even when historically, when we have decided at periods of time to opt out of our Judaism, which by normal laws of history would just have us disappear, we understand that our role in history is too critical, and we cannot just disappear. So one of the great supernatural aspects of Jew hate is that the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have very often taken place in places where we're most like the non-Jews. The general reason why you don't like another group of people is because they're different from you. Like, I'm white, you're black. I'm this faith, you're that faith. But the more you're like me, the less difference there is, and the more we should get along, until eventually we merge. If you're the minority into me, and then you're gone. While individual Jews can opt out, you see this in Germany. you hit a certain critical mass, there's a certain algorithm I've never worked out, and then we at least expected, when we're seemingly most comfortable and accepted, will suddenly come these incredible explosions of anti-Semitism, which is suddenly telling us that even if we try and disappear, the non-Jewish world's going to remind us that even if you assimilate, we know you're still Jewish.
Yeah, and it's amazing, and I actually can't think of any other examples of other minorities that have experienced history in this way. Do you think there's anything particular to learn from the fact that even though this was the Greeks invading Israel and they didn't exile the Jews, but we still call it an exile? Why is that, and what is the message behind that?
Yeah, so there's a number of, you're talking about the prophecy of Daniel, and Daniel has this beast with the four heads, and it's Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome are viewed as the enemies of the Jews, and whereas the Babylonians, yes, will exile the Jews, and the Romans, they destroy the first temple and exile us to Babylon, which is Iraq today, and the Romans will decimate the land of Israel, and while not like literally taking us out like the Babylonians did, their persecution and the economic and physical hardship and the massive destruction will lead to a mass depopulation of the land by the Jewish people, fleeing diaspora for greener pastures, for survival. But so I think exile is more viewed as a term of a threat to us, an attempt to get rid of us one way or another. Whether it's by the Persia was all about the story of Purim, which takes place in the exile. So that was an attempt. That was an attempt to basically exterminate the entire Jewish people. It's the forerunner of the Holocaust, thousands of years later. So I don't know necessarily has to be viewed as a physical exile, but rather as in terms of a punishment or a distancing of us from even our physical lives.